Hello and welcome everyone to Human Rights in Business 204. This is a training developed in partnership between BSR and Business Call to Action. We've done a number of other trainings so far, one on an introduction to human rights, that was Human Rights 101, as well as a few other industry deep dives on food, bev, and agriculture, consumer goods, and then financial services. So this is the fourth of our industry deep dives. And we also have two other trainings coming up this week, including a data protection and privacy training tomorrow at the same time, and then a training on Thursday looking at the human rights toolkit that Business Call to Action has on their website, and going through the toolkit and looking at how businesses can use it to improve the way that they approach human rights and integrating it into their operations and evaluation of their supply chain. So if you're available to join us for either of those, please feel free to go to Business Call to Action's website and look for more information. We're glad that you're with us today and look forward to productive conversation about the infrastructure, energy, and utilities sector. We welcome you to take yourself off mute and jump in if you have any questions, or to use the chat function, which is in the bottom right hand of your screen if you have any questions. Today's training will cover 5 different issues that come up in the infrastructure, energy, and utilities industry: land acquisition and resettlement, bribery and corruption, forced labor, child labor, and human rights defenders. And for each of these 5 issues, we will take a look at the overview of the issue and how it relates to the industry, a couple of cases and examples, and then some tips and guidance on what business can do. To give you a little bit more background about who you're hearing on the line, my name is Michaela Lee, and I'm a manager at BSR, Business for Social Responsibility. My colleague, Peter Nestor, is also on the line. He's a director in our human rights practice. And then we also have another colleague, Cynthia Wang, who has joined us as well. Peter and I have both significant experience working on human rights projects and working with companies on respecting the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We also have experience across a range of different industries, including the infrastructure, utilities, and energy industries. And we're excited to be providing this training to you today. BSR is a global nonprofit business network. We have offices around the world. We work with about 250 companies and other partners to build a just and sustainable world. We do quite a bit of work on human rights, but we also do work on other sustainability issues, including women's empowerment, inclusive economy. We do work on supply chain issues, as well as sustainability management issues. And we work with companies to address all of those. For this particular training series, we've been working with the Business Call to Action. And to tell us a little bit more about Business Call to Action and what it means to be an inclusive business, Ivan, if you could jump in, that would be great.
Thank you, Michaela. This is Ivan. I work as an outreach and membership lead at Business Call to Action. The Business Call to Action is a platform, a membership-based platform for inclusive businesses that was established in 2008 and is hosted by the United Nations Development Programme and supported by 4 donor partners. As of now, we have 223 members globally in more than 67 countries, operating across multiple sectors such as food and beverage, agriculture, consumer products, healthcare, or financial services, and more. And our members come in all sizes. It could be multinational companies, it could be national companies, but majority of them are small and medium enterprises. What all our members share in common is that they follow inclusive business model. As such, jointly, they have, as of now, pledged to provide access to financial services to nearly 60 million people, improve access to healthcare, enhance access to energy, or ensure decent work and livelihoods of low-income people. Now, what we mean by inclusive business, maybe a few words on this. Inclusive business is defined as a commercially viable business that integrates low-income people in its value chains, either as employees, as suppliers, as distributors, or as consumers of products or services of particular inclusive business. So both aspects are very important. It is commercially sustainable enterprise, but at the same time with positive societal and environmental impact. And typically, the leaders of this sector, the leaders amongst inclusive business, follow responsible environmental, social, and governance standards. And this series is obviously very relevant for inclusive businesses because it is especially them that operate in rather difficult environments where human rights can be an issue, but at the same time, inclusive businesses can provide solutions to some of the challenges related to human rights, as I think has been mentioned several times in previous sessions. So thank you, Michaela, so much from my side for the moment.
Great. Thanks so much, Ivan. All right. At this point, we're going to move into some of the meat of the content here, and I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Peter.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you very much, Michaela, for getting us started, and Ivan for the overview of Business Call to Action. Very excited to get into the training here on infrastructure and utilities projects. We're going to touch on about 5 human rights issues that we are highlighting that come up in the industry. We're also going to focus on some issues that come up around renewable energy projects. So we might often think that simply because you're building a wind farm or a solar panel project that it's sort of net benefit, right? So as long as it's doing good to help the environment, that there's probably no human rights issues there as well. And that's just not always the case. So we've got a couple of examples in here where even solar companies, wind power companies, other renewable energy companies should be paying attention to these issues. This is not exhaustive. There are other issues that we're not going to have time to cover on this call today, but as we've done with each of these trainings, we do want to give you a flavor of what potential human rights issues are specific to each of these industries. So I'm going to get through these slides relatively quickly, although I would invite anybody to jump in with a question, or we can have a short Q&A at the end if you'd like to come in to the webinar at that time. Let me go through a little bit of background for those who might not have been able to join our 101 training on just basic human rights issues. So this slide here is what is a human rights violation, and sometimes it's not always easy to tell. What we've got here is a protest, a community protest over a renewable water project in Thailand, I believe, and they ended up shutting down this project because the indigenous communities were not consulted per both local regulation and also per international guidance on whether or not the project could go forward on their ancestral land. And so they were able to get the project, or the community was able to get the project shut down. In that particular case, although other communities are not as successful in upholding their right to consultation and what some would argue is consent. This is a picture of Berta Cáceres, who was a human rights defender in Honduras and defending communities over issues primarily with mining companies who were very active in terms of local mining companies, in terms of violating local environmental laws, committing other human rights violations. And she was tragically killed a couple of years ago and over one of these big land infrastructure type projects involving mining companies. We'll talk a little bit more about human rights defenders later in the call, and I will point you to a very good new report that has just come out last month, talking about the business obligation to understand how it might be impacting on human rights defenders. The last ones here are intended to be a little bit more ambiguous so that you don't always know whether or not there's a human rights violation. The one on the top here are working conditions that may not be safe. They may not be respectful of the workers' rights to fair and favorable working conditions. In this particular case, they're installing solar panels. It looks like it's in a hot region, so it's making sure they have enough water, that they're wearing the right protective gear, and that they are not being worked too hard. This picture on the bottom here with the circles coming out of this person's ear, those are intended to be sound waves coming from these giant new wind power stations, so indicating there might be some impacts from noise or other impacts are affecting the community from a big new wind station. So all of which may impact their right to enjoy livelihood or other issues that are impacting people. As in all cases, it doesn't mean that the projects cannot necessarily go forward, both under the guiding principles, which we'll talk about for business and human rights, BSR, a business call to action. All of our theories are that these projects and business should flourish, business should work, business should be able to do what it's set up to do, which is build these kinds of projects, develop new products. But it has to do it in a way that is respectful of the human rights of existing communities. And as we get into it here, we'll talk more about indigenous communities and workers and other employees and others affected by their operations. So that's kind of the overarching theme and message that we want to make sure that we get across. The best way to think about human rights are that it is a code of conduct for all human beings, regardless of what country you're from. You are entitled to not be subject to slavery conditions. You're entitled to be paid for work that you do. You are entitled to show up and work and not be discriminated against, and to have the right to join a union, and to free expression, and to just and favorable work conditions. So all of those were laid down in 1948 for the first time in the modern world in what's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you were doing some quick math, this is the 70th anniversary of the UDHR, and December 10th is International Human Rights Day, and so there will be a lot of publications coming out and various reports and things celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I will point you over there to take a look at what the basic list of human rights are. There's 30 of them that are listed there. They are high level, and over the past 70 years, they have been developed more through international conventions, treaties, and through domestic laws that countries are required to adopt as they are committing to implementing human rights. Another one of these guidance documents, so not a treaty, not a convention, but a standard that was adopted by the United Nations in 2011, is called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And this is the standard that guides business to understand what their human rights impacts are. It does not create any new human rights. It simply lays out a management template for businesses to be able to understand and adopt the right policies and processes so that human rights can be respected throughout their operations. You'll see the three pillars here: the state duty to protect human rights, that's to pass laws that actually, and to enforce those laws that actually protect people's human rights. But companies in the middle pillar here have an obligation to respect human rights. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And then both have an opportunity to provide remedy. If you want a little bit more background on the guiding principles, I would direct you over to our 101 training, which is now available on the Business Call to Action website. Okay, very good. So let's get into a few issues that come up in the infrastructure and utilities and energy sector here. Okay, the first one is on land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. So, excuse me. Again, what we're talking about here in many cases are large capital infrastructure projects that are going to require a significant amount of land. In most cases, we would hope that that land has been acquired legally, that people who might be on the land are consulted and are given an opportunity to pay a fair market price or to reject the sale of their land if they want to. But in reality, that is not always the case. So, you know, under the human rights regime, there's a couple different areas where this comes up. In Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the article that covers the right to own property, everyone has the right to own property, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of their property. Another situation where it arises is primarily for indigenous communities who are often vulnerable communities in specific countries and often have indigenous claims or historical claims to land in countries, but often don't have a way to prove ownership over that land. Usually, or in many cases, it's just oral transactions that are taking place or historical, traditional transactions, but there's no way to write down who actually owned that land. And so they are subject to sort of usually by force or otherwise by fraud to sometimes be physically removed from the land. The UN has adopted a principle that applies for indigenous communities. It's called the FPIC principle. You'll often hear it referred to as FPIC, as we've got abbreviated here in the second bullet point. That stands for free, prior, and informed consent, and the requirement there is that any time that there is going to be construction or use of indigenous land, that the indigenous populations are consulted and permission is given to the organization that is developing the land, and that permission is given freely. It is given prior to the actual construction, so you don't start constructing and building something and then going back and saying, oh, by the way, do you mind if we're here? Informed, so making sure that people know what they are giving their consent to. And then the last one here is consent, and that tends to be the most controversial part of the FPIC process. Some people argue that it gives communities a veto power over these projects. Other people say, well, it should be more like consultation rather than consent, or consensus rather than consent. But there's an ongoing debate over exactly what that means. There's some really good free resources available. One area that I would point you to is the UN Global Compact Business Dilemmas Forum. They have a big section on FPIC, and you can read about different case studies and what's been going on there. But those are all grounded in the right to property. And so a couple areas where we've seen this come up. This particular picture, I think, is from Nigeria, where there were more than 30,000 people were homeless after being evicted, in this case by the state. In many cases, one question you might have as well is, are businesses really coming in and forcibly evicting people? In some cases, maybe so, but in many cases, it's usually in conjunction with the state, or the state is the first party to get there and actually complete the eviction or notify people that they might be evicted. But then it's in the service of a particular company. That might not be known by a lot of community members, and it might be something that is, based on corruption or bribery behind the scenes. So it's not always the company that is necessarily doing the eviction or land acquisition. In many cases, in this particular case in Nigeria, the residents were not provided consultation, appropriate compensation, or alternative housing. 2016 survey, just to give you a sense of how widely used FPIC is right now, or not widely used it is, a survey out of 50 wind and hydropower companies found that 34 of them did complete consultations with communities, but if you continue reading down that third bullet point, only 5 out of 50 did it according to the free, prior, and informed consent principles. So it's not the same as community consultation. It's not the same as stakeholder engagement. There are certain processes that should be followed, and there are some good documents and guidance materials out there now for businesses on how to do free, prior, and informed consent. So I understand, some of the companies on this call may or may not be involved in very large infrastructure projects, but there are different ways that it can come up in your value chain. So, again, going back to the guiding principles and the key management concept in the guiding principles for business is to conduct due diligence, and so we would encourage companies to conduct due diligence both upstream and downstream in their value chain. So taking a look at where their raw materials are coming from, or where their customers are, where they're selling, or in their own operations. Just a little bit of guidance here on the left part of this slide. And just a note, we do tend to put a lot of text on our slides, and the reason is so that you can have them afterwards and follow along and understand what we're talking about. We've got some links over to other resources over here, a good report that BSR put out back in 2012 on engaging with FPIC, but as I mentioned, there are a lot of other good reports out there, and I would point you to the Global Compact page on this. All right, very good. Let's move on to another issue here, unless we have any questions. All right, second one here is on bribery and corruption. Bribery and corruption is not necessarily a human right. It doesn't necessarily say that everyone has the right to be free from bribery or corruption, but what anybody could tell you, and what the empirical data will show you, is that where there are extensive cases of bribery and corruption between business and other businesses, or business and the government, there are often also a lot of human rights violations. And so it's important to take a look at bribery and corruption. One thing that we note here, so if you look under the bullet, why does this happen? Corruption exists in all countries, probably in all industries, but where there is exchange of land, or where there's a high degree of overlap between the public and the private sector, that often creates more opportunities for corruption to occur. And that is the case with utilities, energy, infrastructure projects, all the way from the land acquisition and working with the governments to acquire particular land, but also throughout the permitting process, right? There's a number of different permits that are required for these large infrastructure projects to go forward, and that does, again, create opportunities for corruption. Just a couple more one more bullet point here, I guess the third one. Corruption is often a structural obstacle to the enjoyment of human rights and disproportionately affects vulnerable communities, either by misdirecting funds that could be spent on healthcare, education, or other public goods, or by preventing participation in the democratic process. So just to make a little bit clearer there exactly why we're talking about this on human rights. The last bullet point there is the point I was making about why this tends to happen, or why it's a risk, a higher risk in an industry with large capital investment projects like this. Good. A couple of examples here. I think we pretty much talked about this. The sub-bullet points, again, just highlighting why in the energy sector this tends to be a problem. The industry usually operates under a tender process where the incentive to pay bribes is often high. Energy contracts are also very large contracts, right? Often in billions of dollars, long-term contracts, and so again, creating more opportunity or more incentives for bribery. Just a statistic here, 65% of the population in Vietnam are reported having to have paid a bribe when accessing public energy sector services and utilities, while with richer people being more likely to pay bribes than poor people. So again, kind of disadvantaging poor people here, where it's common in the society to have to pay bribes to get just basic access to utilities. There is a lot of guidance on anti-corruption and how to build a good anti-corruption program. If you are doing business with, or if you are a company headquartered in the United States, you are probably covered by a law called the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA. This requires companies to set up an anti-corruption program, anti-bribery program, and take proactive steps to educate employees about corruption and bribery, and to build systems to mitigate the control. The UK has similar legislation. Several other countries have similar legislation, but you could also ground it in human rights principles if you're trying to develop an anti-corruption program. Some of the resources that we have over here from the OECD are also very detailed in terms of how to understand and manage risks on anti-corruption and bribery. All right, we'll talk a little bit here about forced and child labor, and just to show some examples of how this can come up again in the utilities, energy, and infrastructure sector. We did talk about this a little bit in our agriculture, training, and in our consumer goods training. So forced labor is any work where people cannot freely exit that work. We've talked about this in the past, that it's often referred to as modern slavery, or you might be familiar with the UK Modern Slavery Act. The problem with that term is that it makes it sound like what we're looking for are people who are in chains, or people who we commonly think of as being held in slave-like conditions, but it doesn't have to be like that. It could be any kind of situation where somebody is forced or coerced or threatened to stay at work, and so therefore cannot freely leave. One of the areas that we talked about on our earlier call was over recruiting fees and debt, what's called debt bondage, which is where workers will pay a significant amount of money in order to acquire a job or attain a job in usually in a different country. They usually become migrant workers. And the debt is so severe that in reality they cannot leave their particular job. So that is also considered a form of forced labor. It could also be situations where there's horrible working conditions, but for whatever reason the person is physically confined to that space. Maybe it's a factory where the doors or the exits are locked, or it's some kind of a camp where there's no way to exit. Another common way that we see forced labor present itself is in the confiscation of passports and other identity documents. And so that's one that is, in many cases, requires some education, some toughness in terms of working with suppliers that may not want to allow employees to have access to their identity documents. But it's one that all companies should keep an eye on and be certain that it doesn't happen in your own operations. But also wherever you can work with suppliers to make sure that it doesn't happen in their operations, that's really important to do as well. So we've got a couple of other examples here of forced labor on this particular slide. A couple areas where we've seen it specifically in the infrastructure sector arises often during the construction phase of major projects. There's been a lot of attention on work going on in the Middle East right now, around the World Cup and the Expo and other major projects over there. There's a lot of migrant labor that's coming from Nepal, Bangladesh, India, in that corridor and over to the Middle East. And when they arrive, they often find that the working conditions are horrible, or that they're in so much debt that they can't go back, or there are a number of other health and safety problems that all would qualify as human rights issues, forced labor being one of the most severe. So the ILO estimates that 23% of forced labor profits are generated in construction, manufacturing, and mining. And then as you get further down in the supply chain, there's a greater risk that forced labor is occurring at the raw minerals phase, which a lot of companies are involved in, whether it's materials that are going into the construction of these projects or that are used in any of their equipment or other procurement. Those are often part of the supply chain. Good. We've got some resources here on the right. On the left, we've got some questions that you could ask if you are setting up a questionnaire or doing other due diligence on your partners, business partners, to make sure that forced labor does not exist. If you are responding, or if you're required to respond to the UK Modern Slavery Act, where you're required to talk about steps that you're taking to eradicate modern slavery in your supply chain, these are the kinds of things that you can do in terms of setting up a due diligence system, either a self-assessment questionnaire for your suppliers, or actually getting on the phone and trying to talk to some of your high-risk suppliers and make sure that they understand what these risks are and that they're doing everything that they can not to participate in this. I was on one call recently with a few other companies, and just a side note here to say that often what they find when they do audits of their suppliers in high-risk countries on human trafficking and forced labor, they will often say, yeah, we don't have a problem, or we do have a management system in place, but when they get there, that's often not the case. And what they felt was it wasn't that the suppliers or the smaller companies were trying to be misleading or dishonest. They just didn't want to lose the business from these big companies. And it's really hard, I think, and I'm very sympathetic to these smaller suppliers and think, yeah, we don't want Coca-Cola or Amazon or Walmart to think that we have a human trafficking problem or forced labor problem at our organization or our business here. So we'll just say, yeah, everything's under control, everything's fine. So what came out of that call, and what I would encourage you to do as you're talking about this issue with some of your business partners, is to take very much an inquisitive approach. So this is very much a problem that we need to learn more about together. We don't understand enough about it, of where it is or how to solve it or what works, and that it's better for everyone here to be honest and open and as transparent as possible about what some of the issues are, rather than try to pretend or to think that we have everything solved. So really taking that inquisitive, investigative approach rather than a disciplinary approach with any suppliers is really, hopefully, going to yield some better conversations and results. Really, really difficult problem, and one that is helpfully now, I think, on the top of a lot of different companies' agendas because of the Modern Slavery Act and other laws. All right, let's switch over and talk about child labor here for a second. It does happen as well in some of the infrastructure projects, even with a lot of large companies that you might not expect, and often in even some countries that you might not expect. Most countries prohibit, or if not all countries prohibit, child labor to some degree, but it is very difficult when you get out into rural areas, and there is often local cultures or traditions around children starting to do some work either on a farm, if it's agriculture, or maybe working a little bit on a construction site. What the ILO has set forth is that so the best way to think about it is all kids under the age of 13 are not allowed to do any work under international human rights principles, technically. Kids are allowed, or children are allowed to do work, what's called light work, between ages 13 and 15 in the top bullet point here, as long as it does not threaten their health and safety or hinder their education or vocational orientation and training. From the ILO's perspective, children over 15 then are able to work. Lots of countries, including my own here in the United States, allow kids to work at 14. And that number will vary around the world, but somewhere usually between 13, 14, 15, 16 is when children are allowed to work, although, again, non-hazardous, and as long as it does not interfere with their schooling technically. And no hazardous work is allowed to be done by children by the time they're 18. And child labor, of course, which can also often be underpaid or for low pay, or where the children are actually forced to work in these situations. All of those situations are prohibited as well. Often what we see, you'll see children sometimes working on big project sites, but where it tends to be a little bit more prevalent is in the supply chain. So jumping down to the second bullet point here, solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, other materials that are going into wind turbines. We hear a lot about 3TG, the tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, primarily in the DRC, but also a lot of other minerals that are being used, particularly to power the renewable economy. So cobalt, other materials that are required to make major battery packs or other materials that are used, copper specifically for wind turbines. There are a lot of issues around where those materials are mined as well. So as you're doing your due diligence, again, looking down a little bit farther in the supply chain, trying to get a sense of, all right, where do these materials come from, and where, how much insight do we have? And I would encourage you to push beyond 3TG in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A lot of companies are starting to just move beyond that. So some of that information is good to have, and it's helpful, but there are other issues as well. Just jumping back up to the top bullet point here, often families will migrate to a work site that's set up to build a project that's obviously away from their home. They will bring their families with them, but there's no infrastructure that's set up to take care of the families. And so it can be very important, or it is very important, to make sure that if you are operating one of those sites, that you're thinking through what provisions might need to be there for children to help prevent them from working on site, whether it's building a school or offering other community services. That's something that may be within your responsibility to do, or working with the government to do it. In other cases, it's just making sure that families know either that children are not allowed or not required, or not required to work on the site, and that there may need to be some alternative situations that are found for them. All right, we've got some more guidance here on children. Again, it's more just questions that you can ask your suppliers, things to keep an eye out for, some red flags in terms of what's out there, and then some resources here on what to do if you find child labor and different ways that you can address it. It's a really tricky issue. It's not necessarily one where if you see children working on a project site that you might be connected to, the response doesn't necessarily have to be to immediately ask those children to leave. There can be more nuanced approaches or a little bit more of a consultative approach with some of the communities, the families, the parents, to try to figure out what's going on. Is this a structural problem in the community where the company may be one actor among many who need to get involved in a solution? Or is this something where it's simply about education, right? To say, look, children under the age of 18, if it's hazardous work, are not allowed on the site, and we need to figure out some alternative ways to work with them. So usually engagement is the best way to go about trying to work through child labor issues, because it can be a pretty tricky issue. All right, let me pause here just before we jump into a little bit more on civic freedoms and human rights defenders, and just see if there are any questions. Feel free to just take yourself off mute and come into the conversation if you'd like to, or if you'd like to raise your hand, pressing the hand button next to your name at the top, that's fine too.
Yeah, I just have a quick question about what you just mentioned, Peter, about a consultative approach, and just sort of how that interacts with, sort of a pretty, in a lot of cases, sort of a pretty clear understanding about, child labor being totally unacceptable and not really having any gray area there. Just wondering sort of what that kind of consultation can yield, given that, pretty bright restriction.
That's a great question. Thank you, Caleb, for coming in there. I'm thinking, I guess, of just a couple of different situations. So let's take the cocoa industry, for example, chocolate industry, where there has been a huge focus specifically on the Ivory Coast and extensive and widely known child labor, right, that occurs on cocoa plantations. In those cases, there are, there are a couple other examples around cotton in Uzbekistan or rubber tree plantations in Liberia and other parts of Africa, where there are some concerted efforts by companies, by the governments, sometimes international institutions or organizations, where the practice of child labor in those industries is so widespread that the goal there is to really eradicate it and to go in and say, all right, and it's usually kids that are under the age of 13. There's not really a lot of gray area there, and that is, those are, I guess, a couple examples where it's so widely known and there's so much effort around trying to eradicate child labor there that they really are going out and looking for children working on farms, right? And when they do find it, then there's usually some kind of a program to either educate the parents about what's happening, or sort of ask the children to leave or go home or go wherever they can. But some of those support services are in place. I think that kind of highlights then the problem in situations where it's not as widely known or where it's maybe some newer efforts to try to work with children. The problem is that they're often working because the families are so poor and need the extra income anyway, that if you sort of immediately get out there and ask the children to stop working, often that can put the family in a much more difficult situation. What I've seen some companies do is sort of recognize that this is happening on their operation, try to engage and understand with either the families or other community leaders about what's going on, and is this a traditional or cultural practice, and are the kids taken care of? Are they safe? Do they have the right equipment? Is there a way that they could work maybe 1 or 2 hours rather than 6, 7, or 8? Is there any place that they can go in the community, whether it's some kind of a daycare center, or is there a way that we could set up a daycare center? If there's no schools, is that a project that the company and the local government could work on to help create some schools? I've also been in situations where there are a ton of schools, but still a lot of kids working in this case, agriculture fields. And the reason is because this area was so rural that no teachers wanted to come teach there. And so sort of scratching the root cause a little bit more, it was just the lack of teachers. And so again, there's a project that a company could undertake with the local government to say, all right, how can we incentivize some teachers to come down here and help work in these schools? So all of that to say that with this particular issue, it often just tends to be, especially in emerging economies, it tends to be a lot more complicated than it initially seems when you see kids working there.
Great, thanks.
Good, thanks for coming in. All right, let's move forward here. I do want to get through a couple of examples and make sure that we end on time. There's been a lot of focus right now on what's called here HRDs, which are human rights defenders, and the closing civic space for human rights defenders to work. There are sort of some confusion, some ambiguity around exactly who is a human rights defender and who may be an opportunistic community member. There are some definitions that are provided, but what we all are seeing and can agree on is that the attacks against people who are trying to support the human rights of communities have increased over the past few years. And at this point, it's up well into the thousands of people that have been attacked or killed for projects related to business. So this is becoming a business and human rights issue. It is a tricky one for companies to try to figure out what their scope of responsibility is, because in many cases, it's that things like a free press are restricted by the government, by the host government. The right to free expression is restricted. The right to join a union is restricted. And so there's often very few ways that community members can raise these concerns. And so it often takes the form of community protests or other agitating tactics, which can sometimes end very tragically. and unjustly for people who are trying to get there. I would just point you to the third bullet point here on this slide. In 2015, the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights Defenders identified human rights defenders working on business and human rights as one of the most vulnerable groups of defenders. So promoting environmental territorial rights and rights linked to access to land have been increasingly targeted for their work. I mentioned this woman, Berta Caceres from Honduras, who was from Honduras, sorry, who was very tragically murdered for her work protesting the mining operations there. But the number of attacks have continued to increase. It's not just on big mining projects, it's also for people who are often exercising their rights online. The tragic events of Jamal Khashoggi and what's happening right now in the news are all examples of not necessarily business and human rights, but how human rights defenders are continuously being prosecuted for expressing opposition to a business or to a government. Let me point you to the top resource here. The BHRRC is the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. It's a phenomenal free resource on business and human rights. And the link to this top report here was just published last month, and it is called Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders Guidance for Companies. Highly recommend folks taking a look at that. It lays out some very pragmatic steps that companies can take to conduct an assessment to understand where their operations might be impacting human rights defenders, and give some case studies of what companies are actually doing to help protect or support human rights defenders in very high risk projects and sites. It can be something that business has to do behind the scenes. That's fine. It can also be something that a business should, in many cases, do with other businesses working there. There were recently a number of international clothing retailers that came together to push very hard against the Cambodian government to make sure that they were both listening to some of the protests that were happening in Cambodia around the right to join a trade union and fair working conditions and fair wages, but then also to change the laws where they raised the minimum wage and actually allowed people to join unions. So there was company involvement behind doing that. That's a very good example of how collective action among companies can help support human rights defenders. So we do have some other ideas on this. The third bullet point here, does company policy embed the responsibility to respect human rights defenders? So what we would encourage and advise companies to do there is to think about whether or not they'd like to adopt a position statement or a policy even on what happens if there are significant human rights defender issues in their operations. A lot more to be said about defenders, but I would point you to a lot of these different resources over here just to get a little bit more, a few more examples or a few more guidance points. Good. Let me just give a few examples here. And what you'll find is that we're highlighting some companies, some of which are in the business call to action membership, others which are big companies, but both where they've got great opportunities to advance human rights. But then we've called them challenges. I think it's more just identifying, potential areas of risk. We're not calling out these companies, just using them as examples so that we can try to connect this to as many companies as possible. So On Energy is a solar energy company. They do manufacturing installation for solar rooftops. They focus on rural communities, in some cases in emerging economies. But as you'll see here over on the opportunities box, they have been able to bring solar power to over 500,000 rural households, which is really, really good. What can, for On Energy and others, what can often get lost, though, in these really positive stories is just to make sure that wherever they're sourcing from is that those companies are doing business ethically and with respect for human rights, and that wherever they're working in communities, they are making sure that there's good consent for these for any solar projects that they're doing there, and making sure that the appropriate communities were consulted before just going on the land and building a project. I would also note, again, just to give an example from the United States most recently, FPIC and the free prior informed consent concepts often rise above local law. We had a really big issue over the last couple of years with the Dakota Access Pipeline issue, where even though the companies involved in that situation had the right permits, they followed all the local law, they failed to follow the free prior and informed consent guidance and international principles, and so that is, among a number of other problems, that was what put them on the front page and got them into some trouble. So just to simply say, well, we've got all of our permits in place. Sometimes the local law doesn't require consultation. It's important to remember that from a human rights standpoint, it is required, and so not to forget about that. This is a company called Buffalo Grid, and they provide, you can see a little example of the box, the red box in the picture here. They provide a very small little charging station to charge charge mobile phones and other small electronic devices, which they were doing their research in terms of how they could make a big impact in rural communities, I think specifically in India and sub-Saharan Africa. They figured out that actually having charging stations was a really big problem. So they deployed these charging stations to small local mom and pop shops and kiosks in these rural communities. The challenge or the opportunity to identify a human rights issue here is really in the sourcing. So using these generators, potentially have minerals and other materials in them that are coming from operations that might not be respectful of human rights. And so important for even small companies to start getting on the phone and making sure that they are doing some research into what's happening. I wanted to give an example here of a very big project. So this is ENGIE. They are I believe a French company, European wind power, European wind power company. And this is a process going back and forth with local communities, primarily local fishermen, for a wind power project that was set at sea. The company did engage with the fishermen. They were initially opposed to this project. ENGIE changed its plans. It's based on that interaction and based on those engagements. The new proposal still was not accepted by the fishermen, and it continued over the process of 2.5 years of dialogue with this local community. Eventually, they did provide their consent to the project, and so just a good example here of how some good project planning at the early stages to allow for consultation and allow for extended consultation on some of these projects is important. But ultimately, if you can gain what's sometimes referred to as the social license to operate, that can make it much smoother sailing going forward in terms of working with the community and making sure that the project doesn't run into future problems. So more and more companies are starting to do that, and that is both required by human rights principles, but also really good business practice. The last example here is wind farm in South Africa, where there was, again, good community and stakeholder consultation, which was required before the operations began. And that is, again, what this particular company did. In this case, I think it was probably required by local law, but there are companies that will often adhere to just the letter of the law and say, well, we had a consultation and one person showed up, and so that's it. And others that, like Jeffreys Bay here, where they actually got out in the community and were proactively talking to people. So better to adhere to the spirit of the law rather than just the letter of it, and really make sure that you're doing some good community engagement and consultation on these issues. All right, I think with that, I want to make sure that we get people wrapped up here in time, but I'd be open to one or two questions if there's anyone else that would like to come on to the conversation here and ask a question before we close. I'll go on pause here just for about 5 or 6 seconds, and feel free to come on the line. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining today, and thanks again to Yvonne and the team at the Business Call to Action These slides will be available up on the Business Call to Action website. We've got a SurveyMonkey link here where I don't think you can access it through the WebEx link, but if you get a chance to take a look at the slides, we would love to hear feedback on whether this was helpful for you or not. Michaela and I can both be reached at BSR. Our emails are online. We're open to any continued conversation about these issues and the range of corporate responsibility issues that Michaela talked about at the top of the call that we're all working on. Feel free to join us tomorrow on data protection and privacy, and then also the day after that on using tools that we've made available publicly on how to assess and understand human rights impacts. So we look forward to doing those webinars, and thank you everyone for joining this morning. I hope you have a great day wherever you may be. Thanks.